more people. All right, I think we can start. It's 1:03 Eastern Standard Time. I'm sure there are going to be more people joining in. My name is Alex Frelichman. I'm with Telrad. And this webinar is conducted jointly with Federated Wireless. Ken Jackson is on Federated side. We'll talk a little bit more about PAL management and essentially how to take advantage fully about the PALs. As you know, we just recently finished the auction, so now there are more questions than we had a month ago, and we are here to address some of those anxieties and concerns. On that note, Ken, if you don't mind taking it from here.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alex. Welcome, everybody. Pleased to be here today in conjunction with Telrad to try to start demystifying and helping everybody better understand the CBRS transition from GAA into PAL. We've got a series of information here that we hope will be useful to you, and then we'll save time at the end for questions. If you have questions, please put them into the chat window and we'll work to address them at the end of the webinar. So where are we at with PAL? Together, Federated and Telrad, we are here. We're ready to support your business and support you, whether you are a PAL licensee or you are continuing with GAA and don't understand what PAL may do to your existing deployments. We're going to work to address both sides of that equation in the webinar today. From an initiation perspective, today Telrad has got actually a base station, 5 high-powered CPEs, and I believe 3 additional high-powered CPE models coming in the near term that are Part 96 certified and ready to support your business and growth into CBRS. Likewise, Federated exited the initial commercial deployment in January this year and have been fully commercial. As a part of the certification of the SAS administrators, we already have been certified for PAL protection and management. Now we're getting the licenses and getting ready to start invoking what that means. So there are a number of facets around that. Federated is engaged with our colleagues from other SAS administrators, as well as our colleagues within the standards organization, WinForm. And we're putting things in place to operationalize the PAL implementation process. We're going to show some timelines here in just a minute and some other aspects around that. And then together, Federated and Telrad are working with you, our customers, to get ready for this rollout commencing early next year. So where have we been? Where were we going? Actually, the auction concluded towards the end of August. Winners were announced by the FCC very 1st of September, and the people who were successful in the auction have been doing form submission, down payments, and final payments. That now is all behind us, and here we sit at the very end of October waiting for the FCC to actually issue the licenses to those who completed the auction and submitted all the payments and paperwork. So looking into next month, November, and where we go to February, the next step is going to be the licensees are going to have the ability to log into a GUI that is independent of their SAS administrator and record their preferences for PAL channels. There are other algorithms that have been defined that include other components like how many licenses in a specific county did a particular licensee win. And as we all know, several of our counties are within a metropolitan area that is consisting of numerous counties, 2, 3, sometimes even 4. And so one of the other criteria for the algorithm will be whether or not a particular licensee has purchased licenses in contiguous counties. And in that case, the algorithm is going to do everything possible to allocate the same channels across contiguous counties. And then there are other factors, including each licensee being able to list their preferences if they have any for specific channels. So that will all be undertaken in the month of November. Coming out of that, very early December, by the way, this timeline is in conjunction with all of the approved SAS admins and working in conjunction with the WIN Forum. This is not a federated specific timeline. So 1st of December, the initial PAL channel mapping results are going to be published in a database that's going to be hosted by the WIN Forum. And then throughout the month of December, licensees are going to have the opportunity to request channel swapping. Obviously, the algorithms are still going to be put in place because there are a sequence of things and some, I'll say, prioritization on how those PAL channels have been put together. Not everybody who requests a channel swap is going to end up getting exactly what they ask for. But that process will commence throughout the month of December. And at the end of December will be when the final PAL channel mapping results are issued just in time for the new year. We then go into January, and there's going to be a series of interoperability tests that are going to be done first between all the SAS admins to make sure that we're exchanging information over the SAS to SAS protocols and that we're all interoperating according to everything that's been laid out. And then we're also expecting SAS to OEM testing. Telrad and Federated have been longtime ecosystem partners. Federated is the only SAS administrator that has a partner program, and we'll be doing interoperability testing during the month of January to ensure also that you have confidence that the Telrad radios will be working correctly with the Federated SAS for all the important PAL functionality. At the end of January, we're looking at the commencement of a phased PAL rollout. We'll talk about that a little bit more as the webinar progresses. And then going into February, at that point, migration of existing PAL license holders and existing grants will be completed. And at that point going forward, everything will be fully automated for PAL and GA grants from a channel acquisition and transmission perspective. So that's our timeline. We're going to revisit this in a couple different ways as the webinar progresses here. So the next thing that I want to do is spend just a few minutes kind of talking about the end-to-end process and also part of what the SAS administrators, and in particular the Federated Spectrum Controller, which is our product name for our SAS, is going to be doing. Overall and in general, this is applicable to every SAS, but obviously we're focusing on the Federated SAS here today. So what is already in progress and to the large extent has been completed, starting from left to right, is that the PAL licensees have had to provide their respective SAS administrators their FRN, the FCC registration number that they have. Each SAS provides their customers a user ID, abbreviated UR-ID, and most of you are probably aware by now that user ID is programmed into, in this case, the Telrad domain proxy EMS, and that user ID is part of the authentication with the SAS. So this is a one-time input because the operator FRNs must be mapped over to the SAS user IDs. That information is then stored so that as a user ID is implemented and used to request grants, we then know that those grants are associated with a specific PAL license based on the FRN mapping. This is just a little bit of a nuance, but it has to do with how the FCC licenses are tracked in the universal licensing system versus how grants are actually requested from SASs using user IDs. So we have to do some mapping processes. Depending on whether the PAL licensee already has CBSD radios deployed using GAA, or if it's something that is in the works. Basically, radios have to be registered in order for the SAS to then go about doing anything. And that's true whether it's GAA grants or PAL grants. What we are also wanting to reassure is that if you are a PAL licensee and you have already registered CBSDs, you do not need to re-register them. We're just implying here that radios have to be registered in order for the following activities to then commence. So radios get registered. Of course, CPI data must be correctly set up in order for that registration to be successful. There is no difference in PAL versus GAA when it comes to CPI. If you're doing high power radios of any kind, whether they're category A or category B, you still must do CPI regardless of whether you're a PAL license holder or not. So once we then move into having this PAL process implemented, what we're going to have for the SAS to access is the universal licensing system to understand who has the licenses, and then also that final channel mapping is going to be in a WinForm database, and the SAS will be referencing that database as well. We then get grant requests from PAL license holders. We validate their PAL status, and then we every night go through a maintenance activity. Most of you who are active in CBRS today are aware of the CPAS process, coordinated procedures amongst SASs, i.e. CPAS. That starts at midnight US Pacific time, and it runs for about 3 hours. So the PAL protection areas will be assessed every night during CPAS. So similar to how activities with GAA work today, when you request a PAL grant, that may or may not be immediately implemented, and then the PAL protection area will be calculated every night during CPAS. When we come out of CPAS, there may or may not be changes to GAA grants within the PAL protection areas. We're going to go into this in a little more detail in the very next slide. The output of all this is that PAL holders with grants associated with their PAL licenses are then protected from GAA users using those same PAL channels. And that's all within the PAL protection area, as well as the area just outside of it, as we're going to now see in this next slide. I'm going to have some animation come here in a minute, but just to kick this slide off, what we're showing here is a section of New Jersey, and we're showing Middlesex County with bordering counties. And what we're showing within Middlesex County is two operators, operator A, who happens to be a PAL licensee, and operator B, who does not have PAL licenses and is operating going forward under GAA. Now, the key thing here is the location of operator A and B and where PAL protection areas are going to exist. I'm going to also augment this slide at the end to show another scenario that we didn't explicitly cover, but I want to also cover in real time here during the webinar. So basically, this is where we're at today, multiple operators within a county. Today, everybody is operating under GAA, obviously, since we don't have PAL yet in place. Now, operator A and B in Middlesex County, we showed two base stations. These could be BTSs, they could be high-powered CPEs. We'll refer to them as CBSDs going forward. Now, they could be very close to each other using the same GAA channels, but having sectors and azimuths that point away from each other. So in theory, it could be possible that you could have two operators using the exact same GAA channels and not interfering with each other. The other scenario is they could be interfering with each other, but they're existing today. And so what will happen once operator A associates all of their PAL information we've talked about earlier into the SAS, and the SAS then completes the very first CPAS for PAL once PAL is in place. We're then showing in blue a circle around operators, the operator A's CBSD, and that circle is the PAL protection area, otherwise known as a PPA. So a couple different things about this. First of all, if operator B's radio that is inside the blue circle is using as GAA the same channel that operator A has for PAL, then coming out of CPAS, the SAS will terminate the grant or grants that are using one or more of the channels of operator A's PAL. Clearly, operator A may have a single 10 megahertz PAL grant, could have multiple 10 megahertz PAL channels depending on the results of the auction. If operator B's CBSD is using one or more of those PAL channels in any number of grants, they will be terminated when that operator B radio is inside the PAL protection area. So that is represented in traffic lights by the red light. Any grant that is GAA inside another operator's PAL protection area overlapping with the PAL channel in any way, shape, or form, that grant will be terminated at the exit of CPAS. Now, what about the next scenario? And I'm going to implement a pen here and do a little bit of highlighting here. So we're now showing another CBSD that I just circled in red that is near the PAL protection area, but is outside of it. So if operator B's CBSD that I just circled in red is within 40 kilometers of that PAL protection area edge, the SAS may tell it to reduce its transmit power. So it will not terminate the grants, but it may reduce the transmit power. Now, this could be a BTS, it could be a high-powered CPE. If it's a BTS, it is potentially a 3-sector scenario. Let's see how well I can do this. And so it could be that BTS on a tower, if it was 3 sectors, if the SAS is going to reduce transmit power, it would only be impacting the sector that I'm shading here in real time because, well, I went over a little bit, because that sector would be pointing into the PAL protection area. So the distance is from the center point of the radios, the CBSDs. If it turns out that the SAS computes power going into the PAL protection area could cause interference to any of operator A's radios inside the protection area, that would be when the SAS would make a request to operator B's radios to reduce transmit power. Let me try to clear that automation here. Okay, and go backwards. All right, so, well, it's still there. Now, the next scenario that I wanted to highlight, and I'll go get my pen and I'll change my pen color this time to a different color. If no, I can't do that. All right, so now I'm going to highlight this radio down here in southern Middlesex County. Before I transition, once again, the yellow traffic light would be associated with the scenario here where we are within 40 kilometers of the PAL protection area, and there is a sector that is transmitting into the PAL protection area, which could cause interference. That would be the case where the SAS would tell that particular CBSD to reduce transmit power. Now, the next scenario I want to cover, and I know that this is a big question that's happening right now, we could have a scenario where we have another PAL holder that is over in Worcester County, and that radio has got a PAL protection area that comes right up on the edge of the county. and then goes around that radio. So this is another PAL protection area for, we'll call it operator C, that's over here in Worcester County. And so in this case, operator B's radio, again, this could be a CPE single sector, it could be a 3-sector radio. And let me see if I can do this a little bit better than I did the previous example. Let's say it's another 3-sector radio. So the way that I drew that sector, it could be that this sector transmitting here could cause interference. It's also possible, but it kind of looks less likely based on the azimuth, that this sector down here could also be causing potential interference to that PAL protection area in the adjacent county. So these are additional scenarios where at the end of CPAS, when operator C's PAL protection area gets put in place, if you are in an adjacent county and you're using the same channels that the PAL holder in Worcester County is using, and your RF transmission could cause interference into the PAL protection area in Worcester County in this example, then again, the SAS would come back to the radio of operator B and request that it reduced transmit power so that the cell edge of operator B's radio basically hits the county border and does not cause interference into the adjacent county. Okay, so we've got a green light for the operator in the south of Middlesex County, assuming that they're not causing interference to operator C in the adjacent county. If it turns out that those channels are the same, then Norfolk, the operator on the south end here could end up being either a yellow light, or it could also be a green light. Again, it depends on the scenario. So hopefully that makes sense. And if not, we'll try to readdress it during the Q&A. Okay, so a little bit more of a kind of a detailed flow here of 3 different use case scenarios. A lot of it's going to depend on whether GAA is already in use and then converts to PAL or not. The use cases kind of get simplified as we go down. The first use case scenario is that we have new CBSD radios that are requesting a PAL channel based on the initial spectrum inquiry that happens with the SAS once a radio registers. So we've got a brand new CBSD that gets deployed, and after the registration with the CPI data is successful, the spectrum inquiry request is performed. If this operator is a PAL licensee and they are registering in a county that they have licenses, the spectrum inquiry response will come back and it will clearly remind or give the radio software an indication that there are PAL channels for that operator available to use. The radio software will then use that information as it goes to the next step to do the grant request on the available PAL channels. Obviously, if an operator has a PAL license and the spectrum inquiry indicates that PAL is available, radio software is going to ensure that that PAL channel is leveraged in the grant to the SAS. Then the SAS will interact and get that PAL channel authorized. And then, as I noted earlier, after CPAS completes, the PAL protection will be put in place. Now, if it turns out that a particular operator has got, I'll just do a little diagram up here. If we've got a radio that is the first deployment of a PAL protection area and we draw a circle, and then the next day the same operator deploys a second radio, then after CPAS, what happens is that PAL protection area now extends around the next radio. And then if the next day another radio is deployed, the same thing happens. After CPAS, now the PAL protection goes something like this. And so kind of going back to that previous example real quick in Middlesex County, over time, operator A, as they deploy more blue radios, then that blue circle is going to grow, and everything that we talked about on this previous slide is going to transform. And in theory, over time, operator A could have a PAL protection area that encompasses the entire county border, and their PAL channels would be excluded from GAA use within the entire county over time if they continue to build out that county. Again, as I noted here in the upper right of this slide, that PAL protection area dynamically grows within the county boundary after every CPAS as more and more radios are associated with those PAL channels. Okay, so that's use case one. Use case two is that we have an operator that's got existing CBSDs that are already registered, and they already have GAA grants, and they're already transmitting. They just happen to be transmitting on channels that are not PAL channels for that operator who has PAL licenses. So remember, we've got a number of people today that are already deployed on GAA, and they are out there potentially using channels that are going to need to be migrated over to PAL channels. How will that happen? Well, one of the ways is through automated software that the CBSD radios can periodically issue a spectrum inquiry request to the SAS. And once the PAL channel availability within the spectrum inquiry starts coming back in January, once we implement the PAL functionality in the SAS, then the radio software can go request new grants and do that associated with the PAL channels. Then the CBSD would get those channels and those grants authorized, and then after CPAS, that PAL protection area would be drawn and the PAL protection would start.
Question, Ken. So while it's going to be re-requesting the PAL, does it mean the downtime until the CPAS, or is it going to be transparent?
That's a great question, Alex. So everything depends on how everything works today through all the existing processes. If it turns out that those PAL channels are available to be used and there are no nearby incumbents, then that grant can in theory be immediately authorized by the SAS, and the CBSD could start transmitting on the PAL channels right away. There also is the case where there could be incumbents or other reasons that the SAS would mark that new PAL grant into the IAP pending status, response code 501, and the new grant would have to wait until CPAS in order for everything to clear IAP and become authorized. So there are a few variables there. And remember, we do not have GAA coexistence yet today in an automated fashion between SASs. So the other thing that obviously could exist here is that if we have multiple operators that are nearby each other, they may be operating on separate channels today. And then as we go to start doing this alignment with PAL, which we're going to show coming up in another slide here, we may have a reason to do some coordination to try to minimize interference, which is obviously in the best interest of everybody that is operating nearby if you have multiple operators in CBRS already today. And clearly that scenario exists in several locations as we speak.
Do you mind if I'm gonna break in with a couple of questions? Well, it's kind of while we're on the topic. Question from Matthew: what if two adjacent counties CBSDs are both PALs?
Sure. Yeah. I was going to cover that in a minute, but let me just go back to this diagram here. I think it best represents it. So I actually mentioned during the timeline slide 3 earlier, that as a part of getting ready for the PAL channel assignments, if it turns out that operator A won PAL channels in both Middlesex County and Worcester County, maybe even Norfolk and Essex and Suffolk. You know, it's possible that a given operator has won PAL channels in a number of adjacent counties. So that is one of the criteria that will go into place for the PAL channel mapping algorithms that we are about to commence amongst all of the SAS administrators. The other thing that I'll reiterate that I mentioned on slide 3 is that this whole process is being done by the SAS administrators working together. So depending on whether you've chosen Federated or any of the other available SAS administrators, this is all going to be united. And what we will attempt to do, which clearly will help in the mobility case, but it could also help if you are a fixed wireless deployment and you have BTSs and high-powered CPEs. It could be possible that you could have a high-powered CPE in Worcester County that is right on the edge of the county line, and it's working with a BTS in Middlesex County, because that ends up being the best signal strength for the high-powered CPE. So if there are adjacent counties with adjacent PALs, then the SAS is going to do everything it can to make sure that a given PAL licensee is going to have the same channels across adjacent counties. It's not guaranteed, but we're going to do everything possible to try to make sure that that's the case.
Awesome. So it's 34 minutes into, so let's continue going, and there are more questions. It's quite interesting from Jason. Hello, Jason. As well. So let's continue going, and we're going to leave the Q&A for a little bit later.
Okay, sure. I've only got a couple of slides here, and then we'll be at the Q&A. So the final use case scenario is that you've got a PAL licensee that has GAA spectrum already, and this in particular is going to be the case with the Federated SAS implementation. It is an optional case, so I can't speak on behalf of my competitors. But if you're using the Federated SAS and you have GAA grants in place, and those GAA grants are aligned with your PAL license channels, you don't have to do anything. Federated SAS is going to immediately create those into PAL protection areas. But again, that is based on the fact that your GAA channels and grants are aligned with your PAL licenses once they are issued at the end of December. Okay, so just kind of another version of the timeline of the phase migration. Again, this is in conjunction with all of the SAS administrators. The month of December is when it's really going to be the prepare phase, and we're going to end at the end of the year with all PAL licensees knowing their assigned channels within each county that they won licenses. Then we're going to move into January, and we're going to start scheduling and phasing the activation. I also mentioned that's when SAS to SAS and SAS to OEM testing would also be done to make sure that once we start phasing that activation, it is transparent and seamless. The last thing we want to do is cause anyone to have service outages with their customers. And then once we get into February, everything would be greenfield moving forward, and things will be automated as new radios register and request grants and move into expanded PAL protection areas. So if you are a PAL license holder beginning in January, if you have existing GAA grants and they do not align with your PAL channels, you're going to want to proactively switch and move your GAA grants to SAS grants that will align with your PAL channels. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, this then, if you're using Federated, would allow you to not have to do anything else as we move to PAL. If you want to have other GA grants in addition to PAL, you can still continue to have secondary GA grants in addition to your PAL grants. If you end up having current grants that are associated with PAL, again, there's no action needed, and you can, if necessary, request additional grants if by chance you have won PAL channels and you're not leveraging those with GA grants. You can clearly go and position yourself with as many grants that would overlap with your PAL as you can before we start the transition. If you happen to be a PAL license holder and you have GAA grants that are going to be owned by a different operator, you for sure need to change your grants to align with your PAL channels. Otherwise, those GAA grants are going to get terminated as soon as that other operator's PAL protection area overlaps with your coverage area. So this is just another way of saying some of the things I've already covered here. However, if you are not a PAL license owner, and you have GA grants that do not in any way, shape, or form conflict with PAL channels, you're safe. You don't need to do anything. Similar to the last example in green above, however, if you are not a PAL license holder and you have GAA grants that are going to be owned by a PAL operator in your county, you need to make sure that you switch over to channels that are not going to be consumed by a PAL protection area once that PPA is created. So wrapping up, you must, if you are a license holder and you have not submitted your FRN to your SAS administrator, you must do that immediately. Just a reminder that a given operator who won PAL licenses can still also have GA grants in addition to PAL grants. As I mentioned during one of the questions earlier, if there are federal incumbents, PAL grants still may have to wait until CPAS before they are authorized and go through the IAP pending state, because federal incumbents have higher priority than PAL. PAL has higher priority than GAA. Again, PAL protection may lead to the termination of conflicting GAA grants within a PAL protection area within a specific county. And the other thing that could happen, which we showed, and I got my red pen out, there could be scenarios where you could be outside of the PAL protection area, but within 40 kilometers of it, and you may be forced to reduce your max EIRP transmit power should your transmission be deemed to be causing interference into the PAL protection area because you are using the same channels as the PAL holder. Okay. The final thing in bold, again, I've said this a few times, if you're a Federated SAS user and you have aligned your GA grants to your PAL channels, the SAS will automatically invoke PAL protection areas for you once we put that software in place. One of the great things about being a Telrad customer, and if you need CPI training and you have not done that yet, we are offering a special promotion as a part of this webinar. Please take note, the code is Telrad, easy to remember. You can go out to that great big long URL. You can also simply type in cpi.federatedwireless.com and you will get out there as well. And you can sign up for our CPI training course, use that code Telrad with a capital T, and you will then get a $100 discount on your CPI training from Federated Wireless. And in closing, before we finish the Q&A, just a few things that you may not be aware of when it comes to Federated Wireless as a SAS administrator. We are absolutely telco grade 5 nines service availability. One of the really important things to note, if you are an operator deploying along the continental United States coastline, we are the only SAS administrator at this point in CBRS that has a fully deployed redundant ESC sensor network. And then on top of that, that network has been in commercial operation for over a year, and we've been fine-tuning it. We actually know real Navy ships versus false alerts. And so we're right now the only SAS administrator that can give you the spectrum and not be suspending your radios due to false positives. As I mentioned with Telrad and other OEMs, we've got a partner program. We're the only SAS administrator that ensures your radios interoperate with our SAS, and that's an ongoing program. We've got a stood up knock. We answer the phone if you call. We respond to support tickets very quickly if you open one. We also now have a portal called My Federated, and you can also get a lot of knowledge there from our knowledge base and community forum. We've mentioned our CPI training program. We've trained more CPIs than any of the other trainers that are out there. And we're not going to compete with you, and we're not going to try to extract any of your customers' data. We're here to be a SAS administrator and to partner with you and Telrad to go have success with CBRS. So you probably know Alex's contact. My contact is here as well. I've also provided the My Federated URL, which is our community knowledge base. And for our SAS customers, it's also where you open up your support tickets. So that's all from me. Alex, what other questions do we have?
Well, on a positive note, I don't feel the only art deficient person on this call. I always say that my art skills equal to about 5 years older. So it's good to see that we are drawing with a similar way. But on a serious note, Ken, thank you. That was educational. I have questions.
Okay.
Let's go back to Jason. And then I have a few more questions, and actually a list is being building. So guys, please feel free to send questions through the chat. If we gonna bleed outside our window, we could complete that offline. So question, do all PAL channels have to be the same for all towers in the county? Or can you select different channels so not to basically to minimize the interference?
I'm trying to parse that. So I'm going to go back a couple of slides here. That a PAL licensee will be assigned one channel for their PAL for the entire county. So if you are a PAL licensee within Middlesex County that we're displaying here right now, you will have, if you won a single 10 megahertz channel, remember PAL licenses are issued in 10 megahertz channels. You may or may not know, but the SAS can operate down in 5 megahertz channel requests. Clearly, if you're doing TDD LTE, you're going to be looking probably at grants that are 20 megahertz each in order for TDD LTE radios to be happy. But SAS can process grant requests for GAA in increments of 5 megahertz. PAL channels are issued in 10 megahertz always. So operator A in Middlesex County, if they had one license, it will be deemed to be one channel. And also remember, these channels are between 3550 and 3650 in the CBRS band. They are the lower 100. Furthermore, they could be any of those 10 channels. There's also been a lot of confusion that PAL channels are always the first 7 out of the 15 total. If you're going to split CBRS into 10 megahertz chunks, you'd have 15 channels from 3550 to 3700. The Part 90 Subpart Z NN licenses were the 3.65 to 3.7. Obviously, those are starting to expire, but PAL channels could be any of the 10 channels from 3550 to 3650.
All right, but if a scenario, let's say we in abstract, you have a 4-sector tower, east, west, north, south, right?
Sure.
You have 20 megahertz to 10 megahertz slices for that particular geography. Let's say north and south will use slice number A, and east and west will use slice number B.
Okay.
How does protections apply in that particular scenario?
Okay, so the PAL protection area is drawn around the latitude and longitude of the CBSD. It's not dependent upon the azimuth and the other CPI data. It could be sitting on the ground, it could be on a 200-foot tower. All of the CPI data, including the azimuth, is not part of that criteria. It's where it is, point on the map, and then the PAL protection area is drawn around it. So your kind of A/B reuse scenario, if you're going to use, I mean, if you only have one PAL channel, if you want to use it within all 4 sectors, then you're going to have to do, well, that would end up, I guess, kind of being more like an omni antenna versus a sectorized antenna. Maybe I'm missing the question.
Well, no, it's an A/B reuse, but it's 2 different 10 megahertz slices. They may be next to each other, but they're not the same frequency. So one may be at 3550, well, at 3560, and another one may be at 3570, just as an
Okay.
example.
All right, yeah, so that's part of what was throwing me off, was that if you only had a single 10 megahertz PAL license, I wasn't quite sure how you could do that. And so it would be A and B on top and A and B on bottom, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So it would be A over here and B over here, and then you would be doing A over here and B over here, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And so, I mean, in that case, again, the PAL protection area would be drawn around the center point of that of where those radios are, latitude and longitude, at least as I understand it. I'm not going to admit to be 100% knowledgeable of the nuances of the algorithms, but my understanding is that PAL protection area is based on the location, not on azimuths and other things.
Awesome. All right, Jason, if you don't mind, I'm going to rephrase your second question. Are there any limitations within Federated if let's say a service provider does have a PAL slice, and then he wants to grab another slice from a GAA over another, non-contiguous carrier? Is there a limitation within Federated that would not allow it to happen?
I'm going to answer that 2 different ways. It's a great question. Thanks for submitting it. Let's talk about contiguous and non-contiguous, because that's going to play a factor in the radio's ability to carrier aggregate those and other things like that, depending on what you're doing. First of all, the straightforward, simple answer is, can a PAL holder have a combination of PAL grants with the SAS and GAA grants with the SAS at the same time? The answer is, for sure, absolutely, without a doubt, yes. Now, will you have the ability to have contiguous PAL and GAA? My answer is, it depends, and you probably shouldn't count on it.
Okay, but then with the contiguous, it's going to be an issue to manage, because one is PAL, one is GAA, so those are 2 different styles, grant styles, essentially.
They are. Now, SAS logic, when possible, is always going to attempt to group grants from one operator together, spectrum-wise, for a specific CBSD, right? And then the other thing that I don't want to get into because it's a webinar in itself and it's still to be fully defined in WinForm standards is GA coexistence. Because GA coexistence is also a notion of grouping, and especially if you're talking a fixed wireless deployment, you would be grouping your high-powered CPEs with your base stations in order to make sure the SAS is keeping them on the same channels within GAA. PAL will obviously also be grouped based on the PAL licenses. So there's a whole, we could probably spin out and have a 2-hour conversation on that, unfortunately, but I would be happy to have a follow-up, Alex, if you want to arrange that at some point. We could certainly go into that on a case-by-case scenario with any of you on the webinar.
Awesome, thank you. Quick answer to Ron. Yes, webinar is being recorded, and once we're done, there are going to be follow-up emails from GoToWebinar sent to everybody, where you could review review the session offline. All right. Quick question from the group. Coexistence between GAA, when do you think, Ken, is the estimate when you're planning to release that software or that capability?
Yeah, it's one of the most frequently asked questions that I get. And by the way, I didn't introduce myself earlier. I apologize for that. I've been with Federated Wireless for 3 years. I'm a technical account director, and I'm technical customer facing. So of all the 40 plus customers that I even personally touched, it's probably the #1 question. Unfortunately, there are 2 pieces to GA coexistence. The first piece is things that Federated can control with all of the customers that we have using our SAS. And so we would call that inter-SAS. We then have the scenario where within a given area, you have 2 different CBRS operators that are deployed with cell edges that are overlapping, and operator A is using Federated Wireless and operator B is using a different SAS. Now we've got intra-SAS coordination that must be done in order to be able to do all of that in an automated way within software. So the first part, inter-SAS, Federated actually has in place in our software today. And we're enhancing that and making changes to it to make it even more efficient going into next year. The big hangup we have within WinForm standards right now is how do up to 5 different approved SAS administrators coordinate via software if we had the scenario where there were 5 operators all with cell sites deployed on top of each other and everybody trying to get clean GAA spectrum. That means that 5 different SASs have to coordinate with each other to determine what channels to give which of the 5 operators. And how we go about doing that is still being worked out within standards. And what I know right now is that the first release of WinForm 2.0 does not include it. So I can't really answer it beyond that.
So time will show, basically the answer, but
Correct.
Work in progress, in other words.
Correct.
Okay, another interesting question from the group. If a company A is using GAA channels and then another company B requesting the same channel, Jason, is this same channel from GAA or as a PAL? So I'm assuming GAA. So if 2 neighboring service providers requesting same channel under GAA in a very similar geography, what happens?
Yeah, that's GA coexistence. And so today, if both of those operators are using the federated SAS, we're going to identify that and we're going to proactively reach out and we're going to try to help you both coordinate so that you don't interfere with each other. Obviously, there's still the ability to do the old-fashioned spectrum analyzer and go out and see what channels are clean and move yourself. But in case it's not obvious, the radio software, and in some cases, depending on whether or not you are specifying specific center frequencies as a part of how the radio software is requesting grants, you may step on each other and interfere with each other. The automated GA coexistence is, again, today in Federated SAS, if you're both with us, we're already working through that. If it turns out that you and the other operator are on different SASs, we have a process for that today, and it's working. And the way that it works is that you open up a ticket with us. If you're our customer, if you're a customer of another SAS, you open up a support ticket with them. We talk to each other. Even though we compete with each other, we do talk to each other. Our NOCs will get together and we'll coordinate with you, and we'll figure out how to get everybody on clean spectrum so that everybody's got a fair slice of GAA. Unfortunately, there's more manual to it than there is automatic when there are multiple SASs involved. That's how things are working today.
Got it. Thank you. All right, we are going to bleed outside our time slot. I mean, most of the room is still here, so I understand it's a hot topic. So if you guys don't mind, we're gonna take maybe another 10-15 minutes to chat, and then we're gonna cut off and finish the remainder of the questions if we don't address them offline.
Sounds
so
great.
Question from Drew is, he would like to clarify, it seems that sectorization is ignored inside of PPA, but the SAS is sector aware in areas near the PPA. Is that correct?
Can you try to restate that? I'm not quite following it, I'm sorry.
So when we are defining PPA, it's defined around the CBSD, even though there isn't a very particular azimuth.
Correct.
For a sector. But the protection is around that particular device, regardless of the azimuth of the coverage, basically.
Correct.
Okay. Yes, Drew, that is correct. Where are PAL licenses?
Let me further elaborate. Sorry, Alex. There is the PPA is a contour, and again, I will caveat that I'm not a software developer that's implemented the algorithms, but when you go in group, and I was trying to show it on this, did it move forward? Or was I trying to show it on this next slide? In the upper right, that contour is not a circle per se. It is a contour, right? And so I wish I could get this dumb thing to give me a different color. But the reality is that contour, it does take into account various different implications of the PAL grants, and then as more radios are added, that contour continues to grow and expand. They're not round circles. And so if I am a little bit off in regards to sectors, I mean, the SAS does know, and it does compute propagation. And so perhaps I'm going to, in real time, pseudo update what I said earlier. Those contours are drawn based on how the SAS is determining the propagation of the PAL grant as it's transmitting. The SAS takes into account the National Terrain Database and the National Land Category Database and all kinds of other things, and how it determines RF propagation from a particular radio. And based on me talking out loud, I am going to say that the PAL protection area would be taking into account sectorization in how it's drawn, along with the lat and long of the radio where it's located. And that would be how, if we go back to this version of the PPA, you would have a contour Now, keep in mind, again, that the county boundary impacts that contour. And so if you're up against a county boundary on one side of a PPA, you will eventually have what we'll say is a hard boundary. But when you're outside of that county, you know, if the county is over here and the PAL protection area is growing, then that contour is going to expand as the SAS computes that propagation and that contour grows. But it will be hard lined along the county boundary.
Mm-hmm. All right. Is there a way for people to see who uses PAL, or if there is a PAL resort in a particular geography, like through when they log into Federated portal, how do they know that there is a PAL in this particular geography, and what are those channels?
Yeah, so the Federated SAS portal is not going to explicitly tell an operator what PAL channels they have. That'll be communicated through the PAL channel mapping process. Let me go back to our time frame. So the timeline that we showed in one of the first slides here. So end of December, the final PAL channel mapping results are going to be communicated. That's going to be published, to my knowledge, through an FCC public notice. And so as a result, everyone using CBRS would then be able to know per county who has what PAL channels, which would then by default let you know what channels are available for GAA. So therein lies your answer. That will then also be, as I noted here, stored in a WinForm database. What I'm not quite sure of is if anybody has the ability to query that database or only SAS admins, but ultimately the PAL channels will be communicated to everybody through a public notice around the end of December, is my understanding.
All right. I know we are addressing it to Drew, and then Matthew, your question is almost the same. I wonder if that is adequate, or if you would like us to provide a link to the FCC website where winner information is available. Okay, that's clear. I'm kind of scrolling to the list. One more question. Can I use PAL questions as GAA if PAL owner is not using those channels at the moment?
I'm sorry, Alex, can you repeat that one more time, please?
Can I use a PAL channels as GAA, under GAA, if a PAL owner is not using those?
Oh,
If he's not
yes, for sure, for sure. Yes, that's a great question, and I apologize that I did not completely, I tried to address that. I'm trying to get my slides to advance here. So when we were going through the example here earlier, I know this slide's getting a little bit messy now, but what we were trying to show, once the PAL protection area gets put in place, if you are outside of the PAL protection area and within the boundaries of a county, then you can use any of that PAL operator's channels as GAA. Now remember, a given county could have as many as 7 separate PAL license holders. And so the worst case scenario for Middlesex County is that you got operators 1 through 7 that have a single 10 megahertz PAL license. And that by default says there's at least 7 operators in that county. If you happen to be the 8th operator, then number 1, you've got at most 80 megahertz of GAA, and number 2, you then will need to be finding GAA that is clearly available. But if you are in an area where your RF transmission is not causing impact into that PAL protection area, then you have the ability to use those channels as GAA. So if you are outside of a PAL protection area and you are not transmitting towards it, causing interference to it, you can use any of those as GAA at high power. If you're within 40 kilometers and you are deemed to be causing interference into the PAL protection area, you can still transmit as GAA, but you will be told to reduce your transmit power, which would reduce your coverage area so as to not bleed into the PAL protection area. Hopefully that covered all the various different scenarios.
Yes, and Charlie is actually asking even better question. And
okay.
okay,
Thanks, Charlie.
Charlie, this is a good stuff, and I'll read the question. And Ken, there are two sides to that question. So Charlie's question, on PPA, if there was a mountain in between the operator A and B within this 40 kilometers, right? So now you have a topographical, you got a hill, mountain, right? So
Yep.
would SAS allow operator B to operate on the same PAL frequency? Just because, you know, RF doesn't propagate through through mountain.
Yep. I just got rid of my animations and I'm going to start with a clean slate here. So we've got, whoops, I've got to move forward. Sorry, forgive me while I get my act together here. Okay, so we've got this scenario that still exists, but if I've got Charlie's question correct, there's a big, come on, pen. I'm sorry.
The answer to your problems is called Mac.
I'm using, no, sir, I'm using a Mac. I'm on two screens though, and I can't get the pen color to work. Basically, there's a mountain that is between operator B's. Maybe it's because it wants me to say I want red. Here we go. Okay, we've got a mountain range right here. Yeah, is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, so the SAS takes that into account, and there would be a much higher probability that this particular CBSD who has a sector blasting this way could operate at max EIRP because he's blasting into the side of a mountain or a hill. Now again, CPI parameters will play a big role here, in particular the height and the down tilt and the azimuth and the beam width. So we all know that those CPI parameters are important, but here's a good example of where they're going to be really important. And so if it's a small rolling hill, maybe not. If you happen to be on the edge of a cliff, which does exist. I mean, sometimes as I travel around, you fly into, I mean, there's even places in California and others where you go land and there's big mountains that are all around. And if you're down in the valley and that PAL protection area is on the other side of what happens to be a pretty steep, you know, quote unquote mountain, yes, that could be a scenario where that CBSD could transmit at maximum power using PAL channels as GAA.
Okay. Now, same scenario, coastal. We bring
Okay.
it closer to the coast. What happens then? So you have a mountain range, let's say 50 miles off the coast. How does that impact the DPA?
Yeah, so it's a very similar scenario. So in this case, we're transitioning and we're not going to talk about PAL for the moment. We're going to talk about a Navy ship in the water that turns on its aircraft control radar system, and a ESC sensor detects that, and now we have one or more impacted channels. As you all know from your CBRS 101, Navy ships typically are going to occupy two 10 megahertz CBRS channels. And depending on your grants, that's going to impact one or more grants and cause them to be suspended if you're on the move list. So I can just kind of draw the US coastline here real quick. And then we've got a mountain range here. And we've got Noah's Ark out here, a really bad boat. And you've got a radio that's over here on the other side of the mountain. Now, keep in mind that this distance, depending on where you're at, coming inland, can be as much as almost 500 kilometers, especially if you're along the East Coast. If you're on the West Coast, they're smaller than that. But that's referred to as the DPA neighborhood, which is out here like this, right? And so if you are within the DPA neighborhood, but you're on, we'll call it the west side of a mountain range between you and the water, then there is a really good chance that your radio will not be on the move list. And it's only when your CBSD is on the move list that you would be impacted by Navy radar. That's the key differentiation there. It's not where you're at physically, it's whether or not you are on the move list or not, as long as you're within the DPA neighborhood. So hopefully that clarified that. It's not related to PAL, but it's a similar type of scenario, yes.
It's similar, but again, PALs are allocated in the lower 100 megahertz, right? So,
yes,
and
they
that's
are.
the same DPA subjected territory, I guess.
Yeah, now let's double click on that. I didn't cover this earlier, but it's a fantastic segue. What happens if you're using a PAL channel and you're on the move list and a Navy ship lights up his radar? Will you get suspended? The answer is you will. However, part of what we're going to be doing to enhance PAL functionality going into next year is that we could offer up a channel change so that you could go move to different channels and lessen the suspension. So you have to remember that CBRS is a tiered architecture, right? It's that pyramid. Most everybody has seen it at this point. GAA is down here, PAL is in the middle, and then federal incumbents are up on top. And so the Navy ship is here, right? And so Navy takes precedence over PAL, PAL takes precedence over GAA. But PAL channels can still be suspended if they're on the move list, and that is just a reality. But being offered alternate channels, and that's not something that's implemented right now, but we're working to get that implemented. What that also could imply would be if a PAL holder is moved to a different channel during Navy suspension, and there was a GA user using it, that GAA grant could then end up being impacted while the PAL holder gets moved. But again, those are future enhancements. Right now, today, the basic aspect would be PAL grants will be suspended just like GAA grants if they're on the move list and subjected to that suspension.
Awesome. And to further support what you just said, Ken, Telrad is working, and this is for the group. Telrad is working on certain automation that will be implemented to, when the time comes, that when Federated does say, "Hey, move to this channel," it's done in in automated fashion. So this will ensure the continuity for the network and to make sure that customers are still being connected. So it's a big deal because at the end of the day, your customers are paying you money for internet connection, not downtime. So yes.
Yeah, the other thing that I'll plug there as well for you, Alex, is that because of the fact that Telrad's implemented the domain proxy scenario, which is controlling both the high-powered CPEs and the ENOB BTSs, If we have to end up moving, Telrad's got the ability to coordinate that, and that's also a really big deal.
Yep, yep. And question from Susan. Hello, Susan. Do PAL channels get assigned dynamically per day until the CPAS?
PAL channels are fixed. So each PAL holder is going to have a fixed PAL channel for a given county where they won the license. So PAL channels are not going to change ever until such a time that they have to be renewed. So potentially for 10 years, a given PAL holder is going to have the exact same PAL channels. Now, maybe the question was a little bit different in regards to immediate grants during the day versus having to wait until CPAS. If that was the question, I attempted to answer that earlier. Let me try to say it again. And we can kind of use this scenario that we've got drawn down here about the Navy, right? And so if this CBSD that we previously were talking about for the DPA neighborhood situation, if it is a new grant and it's requesting PAL and it's within the DPA neighborhood, but let's say that that mountain range actually wasn't there and maybe it's fairly close to the coast, then there is a good probability that that radio will go through a suspension, which is called the IAP pending 501 response code, until CPAS before it is allowed to transmit in the authorized state. That's how GA grants work today, and PAL grants will be subjected to the same type of scenario if the SAS must wait until CPAS. You have to remember that the SAS is much, much more than just a database. And so there are some intensive computations that get done every night in CPAS. It's actually why SASs are done in the cloud as well and not running on a little server in your IT closet. It's a massive amount of computations. And cloud compute allows us to do all these computations within a 3-hour window during the night. So it's just a reality of the fact that anytime we have to do intensive computations, those get postponed until CPAS, and that is why those suspensions with IAP pending occur. And it could be for a satellite Earth station, it could be for any federal incumbent. PAL channels are subjected to IAP pending, just like GA.
Got it. All right, hopefully that was adequate answer, Susan. If anything else, we can take it offline and chat a little bit. All right, now on that note, I would like to be respectful to everybody's time. I mean, it's actually, I've never seen anything like that. 90% of people from the event are still here. So, so thank you, Ken, Federated team. Thank you, Terran, for organizing this event. And would like to really genuinely express my appreciation for your time. I always say time is money, and right now we're in this education phase where lots of unknowns, lots of moving, pieces of the puzzle, and we're trying to address them as they come. We are available offline, phone numbers, emails. The more information you know, the better, obviously it is. And again, Ken, thank you for your time. I appreciate the very informative and kind of a bi-directional session.
Absolutely. Thank you as well. My thanks to everyone who participated and stayed with us. So fantastic session. Thank you, Telrad, for hosting it.
Awesome. Thanks. Bye-bye.